everybody.
Hello, everybody.
Welcome, welcome, welcome.
I'm trying to hide my stained pants because I was out doing something before I came over here and I got grease all over me. So,
Tim's ever the unprofessional.
yeah, I've been accused of being unkept before. So,
Well, we'll see how that goes. Hey, everybody. Good to have you. My brain's in about 80 different places. I ain't gonna lie. Today, got a bunch going on in my head. Um, but that's all right. Before we jump into our study, um, I wanted to share a couple of things uh, that I heard recently. I was just telling Tim about them. We had a guy that we work with, or that I work with at my day job. His sister, I believe, was passed away. I think it was may have been yesterday or just recently in the last few days. And he was just telling a story. She's a believer. They're all very solid believers, real kingdom guys and folks. And he was talking about right before she passed, that she had this vision, as it were. And we always talk, when I was growing up, I always heard about dying grace, and God will be with you when you're about ready to go, and that kind of sort of thing. And I've heard stories about that all my life. But he said that she just kept saying over and over again that he thought she was saying the stars are real. And they're beautiful. And then so she was saying that over and over again. Anyway, a little bit of time went by, and she actually kind of woke up out of her, I guess it was like a coma, and was talking and conversing, and he asked her about it, as I understand the story, that what do you mean the stars are real? And she says, no, the scars, scars, his scars are real and they're beautiful. And that's what she was saying. And then just a little bit later, she went on to be with the Lord.
oh, wow.
And her admonition to him was to just tell everybody that the scars are real and they're beautiful. And I was like, man, that's
cool.
And he was sharing with me that he does not have the gift of evangelism, that he's more of a teacher, and he's just not his gift. But already, just in the last few days, he's been at the hotel, he's been with the rental car company, and he's shared that story with people, and it's already moved people. And he's like, he works with Muslims, and from time to time, it's just a great entry point kind of conversation about it being real and what we believe is real. So
that's pretty cool.
yeah. The other thing that I heard, which was on a podcast, I don't know if you're familiar with, called Remnant Radio, and it's a podcast about charismatic stuff, and it's just one I like to listen to. I like to hear different perspectives on things. But they were interviewing this guy, and one of the things that Tim and I always talk about is, I say we always talk about it comes up every once in a while, that in evangelicalism, especially in Protestantism, we try to narrow what it looks like to walk with God, conversion and salvation, into this one moment. Like it's either happened or it hasn't. And we're always trying to figure out, are we in, are we out, are they in, are they out? And this guy was talking about, it was on their latest podcast, about kind of the fallacy behind trying to take all the promises of God that he's ever given us and shove them into this one moment. And he's like, we know, if we really think about it, that everything God's ever promised us doesn't come to us in that moment. We're not glorified. We're not, we're still in these sinful bodies. We don't see him face to face yet. So even in baptism, and that was kind of the context, he's like, we may be positionally fine. We may be saved, as we would call it. But he's like, all the things that means does not come to us. And we keep trying to shove all of it into that moment and leave it there. And he's like, no, we need to stop doing that. And you said a while ago, it's not about whether you're in or you're out. It's like maybe there is a conversion. That is the moment. But then the rest of our time is getting to know God and getting to know who he is and understanding him. But to me, I just really appreciated the fact that he was saying that we do a disservice to people, really, in trying to shove everything that God has for us into a moment of time. He's not even in a moment of time. He's not constrained by a moment of time.
Yeah.
And we just have this propensity to, we have to put him in there. We have to define, well, how does it work? How does all of it? And it was neat to me to hear somebody else saying some things that we talk about a lot, which is that God lives outside of time, and our desires to put our ideas of order and structure and the way things ought to be onto the way he really is really a detriment to growth in the Lord, and it's not helpful at all.
Well, it's kind of a simple mind way to look at it. I don't even really know how to address this other than to say when I was younger and newer in my faith, I thought, there was a lot more absolutes in terms of how it's supposed to work and what's going to be, and it took time to overcome that. And I've done a lot of preaching and teaching over the years, and I certainly preach and teach a lot different than I did back then.
Yeah.
Not that even a lot of things I taught were wrong necessarily. It's just, I was more, if you do this, then this is going to happen this way.
Right.
And maybe that's true, maybe it's not, but I really didn't know, but I sure thought I did. And that's me looking back. Which kind of segues into...
Yeah, it really does.
Kind of where we're at here. So, I was thinking last week, even when we were, and the week before, we were talking through where we were in 1 Corinthians. And I wrote down in my notes while I think we were actually on air. And you know what? The term went right out of my head. It wasn't intellectual, but what's the fancy word for reading literature?
Academic stuff.
No, literature. So
liturgy?
No, the word literature
that's the one
popped into my head.
Okay,
yeah.
Gotcha.
And the point is that, we talk about even this. So we're going to kind of jump to the end of chapter 13. We're not done with 12. Maybe we got halfway through 12, maybe not quite halfway to it. But he begins to define more about the gifts is what's going on there. And when we were talking about that last week, and I was looking forward in this, the reason I wrote down literature is because this whole time we've been talking about why he is teaching the way he is teaching, what he's trying to get across, though he's bringing up many specific kind of things, which is where we get this. This is the rules for how you do church. I know it's not that simple, but just trying to identify it. And I started thinking, well, you really have to read this like you would literature. His letters, you got to read the whole thing because you need the context.
Right. Yeah.
It doesn't mean that the individual pieces in it are wrong that he's talking about, but it's easy to get lost in going, oh, that's it. When if you read 2 or 3 more paragraphs later, you'd be going, oh, wait a minute, that kind of changes up what we're talking about here a little bit.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think actually we treat a lot of stuff in Scripture that way. We're soundbite generation, especially. I don't know how this was 100 years ago, but we literally live in sound bites, and we live in coffee cups and bumper stickers and proof text preaching. And so we're conditioned to take those pieces and forget that they're part of a bigger picture.
Well, but I would tell you that's been going on for a while, or we wouldn't have, because we complain a lot about the teaching we got when we were younger, or, they're hammering on this one point. Well, but if you'd have read the whole picture of it, you kind of come away with it going, well, that's not really what he's talking about. So I'm not saying that in condemning anybody or anything. And I've even read stuff where you go, well, this is not literature. You don't read. To read is an exercise. So if you read a book, you can run into a part and go, wow, what's happening here? Or, oh, I can see that. But still, you know that you're going to finish the whole thing so that you can see all of it for what's happening in the big picture. It's like going to a movie, I guess.
Yeah.
That makes sense. This is not any different. I'm not trying to put worldliness on top of it.
But it is connected.
It's very connected.
Yeah.
And so, because we do get a lot of steps, this is how you do the Lord's Supper, and this is how women are supposed to carry themselves, and the gifts. These are the gifts, and these are how they're ordered, and this is what it's done. And in reality, he's using all these points and things to talk to them relative to what he was getting into them with to begin with. Basically, he's telling you people should be mature now, but you're not. And here's what you're doing. And in the side notes, this is kind of what's really happening, and this is how it really works. Anyway, that.
Well, I see it as also kind of like almost like examples of like, let me show you how these are some conclusions you should have come up with on your own, but you didn't.
Yeah.
And here's some individual, I'm going to use the word examples, and maybe that's not the right word. Maybe symptoms of their immaturity. You're doing this and you're doing it because you're immature.
Yeah. Well, so point in case kind of at the end of 13, maybe chapter verse 8. In verse 8, he says, love never fails. Because we've been talking about the love chapter above that. We'll get to that. But he says, but if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away. If there are, and it's interesting how this is being phrased, if there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be done away with. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. So basically what he's saying is that all the gifts that he had talked about before this in chapter 12 and how to use them more or less. And he's even just scratching the surface here because there's other places that talk about gifts that, they really are talking about the gifts in those places. But evidently these were issues that they were having as well on top of the other stuff, the visions and all that stuff. They were going to, the Spirit, I do this, so therefore that must be the way it's supposed to be done. And anyway, so that's how he's giving it to them. But he says that all these gifts and all these things come eternity time, when we're really in eternity and we really are with the Lord, like the angels are now, so to speak. All these gifts are going to go away in terms of, because he's saying that in chapter 12, and we'll talk about that, is that it's all one Spirit. We talked about that last week.
Yeah.
So all these little things that are transpiring, you're able to do this, and you're able to do that, and you're able to do that. And one way you ought to be looking at it going, oh, okay, well I can kind of see how I have significance in all this now. It's his significance, but I'm just helping everybody else in that process, and I see how they're helping me. So that's what he's trying to get across to him, that's what it is. But he's saying that all these individual gifts are going to go away because once we we will be transformed at that point.
Yeah.
And whatever that means in terms, we'll be complete. Prophecy won't be needed, all that stuff, because you're going to be direct, face to face with God as we were created to be. And all these things, there's not going to be mysteries anymore.
Right.
And so
it's I think important to note that if you remember way back, we've talked about it before. He said that he talked with Moses direct face to face, and that was different than the way he even talked to the prophets. He talked to the prophets in signs and wonders and riddles and things like that. He's speaking to, and you can kind of hear the vestiges of that. That sort of thing just won't be necessary anymore.
Well, and that's what I would tell somebody. What does it mean to talk to God or be face to face with him? I'd tell them, go ask Moses that question.
Yeah.
And that literally means you can turn back in the Old Testament and watch it happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, what does that got to do with now? Well, that's what you got to deal with him over. I don't have the answers for that stuff.
Well, but that kind of stuff is important because we're always talking here on this podcast, and then we teach, we're always talking about staring in God's face, seeking the face of God, learning who God is, learning how God interacts with his creation, and what that looks like. Now, the reason that's significant to me is whether it's explicitly taught, implicitly, taught by implication, we kind of have this idea a lot of times that we can't really talk to God the way you and I would talk as friends. Now, I think there's a reverence for God, and there's, when he's on the scene, you look at it in Scripture. There's one reaction when he physically comes on the scene, and people go as dead men. They're done. Yeah. And yet, once you kind of pass that through the veil, as it were, we've talked about this before, now that you're dealing in reality and not the shadow of things, we see Moses actually not just talking, but challenging him.
Well, we see in the New Testament, we see Ananias doing that.
Yeah, and not in a, it's, you have to be careful because it's not in a challenging, like,
Yeah, not like, well,
irreverent.
Moses did.
Yeah, and I guess,
think he did. Ananias was going, are you sure about that?
yeah, but I think it's important to 2 Chronicles 16:9 is like our verse that we always go back to, that the eyes of the Lord go to and fro amongst all the earth, looking for hearts who are perfect towards the Lord. I believe Moses' heart was perfect towards the Lord, and the Lord knew that, and what he was saying to him came out of a heart for his people and love for them, and he wasn't chastising God, he was talking to him like a friend, and it says those things.
Yes.
And I believe in 1 Corinthians 13, when the perfect comes, this partial riddles, mysteries, unknowns, all of these things, that's a really loud phone ring. All of these things that we do now are going to come to an end in favor of knowledge and access and all of the things that Moses even had, you know.
Yeah.
And even more.
Well, and it's not even a huge mystery in the fact that Jesus was around and he told his disciples, he said, "You're friends."
Yeah. Yeah.
That revolutionized my grasp of the kingdom when I read that, and I was thinking, well, wait a minute, it's something I can grasp what a friend is.
Yeah.
And that's the position he wants. I mean, it's much more encompassing than that, but he's the one that wants to look at you and deal with you as a friend. And it is on his terms, and I mean that in a good way. I think the reason he could converse with Moses is because all the things Moses had gone. Remember, Moses was an old man before he actually got into that place. And so Moses had relinquished everything he was. We keep talking about giving up the right to yourself. He just handed it over on a plate and said, okay, I'm done. I can't do anything unless you're doing it. And that's why when everybody would grumble at him and this and that, he would turn around and he'd go, why are you getting on to me about this? He's the one that did it.
Yeah.
And he wasn't trying to get out from under anything. It was just the perspective of what that was. And so I don't, you know, they had a hard time figuring that out.
Well, and I think it's easy for us to get into I call it a mindset of liturgy. I mean, it's like when I was growing up, we had this term that I would hear every now and then. We would say high church. You know, there was the good old boy East Texas Baptists, you know, just folks. But then there was high church, you know, them Lutherans and Episcopalians and things that wore robes and you know, and it was formal. And really that's what it boiled down to, was formal versus informal.
Yeah.
And even in the Jewish culture, they had formality. There was the temple, or there was the tabernacle at the time of Moses. And you know, it seemed very formal. But the actual relationship that is highlighted in the scriptures between God and Moses was to some degree informal, in that, I'll just drop my glasses and I gotta have them, in that the way that they spoke, the way that he represented God, even though he still represented him as Yahweh, all encompassing fire and all of that stuff, but he was also displaying this very relatable, loving side of him too. I think of Job when he talks back to God, as it were. Now, he gets a little different response.
Yeah.
He says, why don't you shut up for a minute? And he tells him all this stuff, and Job's response is, I'll cover my mouth with my hand and I won't speak anymore. And then it's kind of like, all right, it comes back down and God gives him back everything. He never kicked him out or whatever. And all of that to say, I think that even when we read stuff like this, we're so afraid of getting it wrong.
Yeah.
One of the things
exactly right.
That guy that I was listening to on this, he said something that just impacted me. He said, historically, evangelicals are we'll go back to the Lord's Supper in 12 or 11, are what we call memorialists. That's the big fancy term, that we only do it as a memory of what Jesus did.
Yeah.
And he said and then when you take that to the hyper end in 11 of, well, if you don't do it just right, you could get sick and die. And he was talking about how he grew up in a tradition they were really afraid. Like, if I have any unconfessed sin, and he said it really was never said this way, but it was understood that the Lord's Supper was really a prize for the super faithful.
Yeah.
And a threat to just normal people.
Yeah.
And it's really not that. It's the feasting on the Lord. He's present in the moment. We even sing about it, you know. Christ is risen today.
Yeah.
Well, no, he was actually, but is Jesus really just this couple 1,000-year-old guy? Or no, his work is being done all the time. And that's hard for us to understand. But I believe this text says when the perfect comes, when we are made like him, that kind of stuff's going to really make a lot more sense to us. We're just going to know. I don't know how that's going to work.
But that's part of Paul's commentary here. He's saying, whatever gift you have, whether it's the gift of service and you're sweeping a floor, or you've got some great magnanimous thing of prophecy that you can really spit out what's happening in any given time or place, and the kingdom's doing it. The rest of us can't see it, but you can. He's saying that thrive in those things, but don't make them your identity, because when you get on the other side, I hate to use that term, we're all going to wind up there, and I don't mean necessarily dying. If he comes first, we're going to be in the glory of how we were created to be. But and when we get to that point, that identity is not going to mean anything.
Right.
And so, and that can be confusing. I get that. But he also says in verse 13, you scroll on down in verse 13, he says, but these things will last forever. That's the one where it says, but now faith, hope, love, abide these three, is how it's rudimentary translated. But what it really means is these three things are eternal. They last forever. On the other side, having faith in God, having the love in your heart, and the hope of who he is, you'll still have those.
Yeah.
The practice of whatever particular gift or gifts that you may have, those are tools here to help us see and learn who God is. That's what John said.
Well, and that's exactly, I think, a great point. You said it. Those are tools. And I think we make an egregious error as the church. We make those things our focus, the end goal. I say it all the stinking time.
Because it looks like something we can do.
Exactly. And
you're missing the point.
And I think that's what Paul's saying here. You're missing the point. Okay, so you've got this great thing. Great. And if you really roll it back into chapter 12 at the end, when he's talking about the different parts of the body, he's like, you may be the greatest big toe ever, but there's going to come a day when it doesn't matter which part of it you were. The things that are going to be left are faith, hope, and love, and you're all a part of the big picture.
Yeah.
And I think it's easy to get into some minute teachings, which are not bad. They're good teachings. But we want to push you past those minute teachings into the idea, the big picture.
Yeah.
What he's really driving home is stop segregating yourselves off. Remember, I'm of Paul, I'm of Apollos. Stop that business. You're all in this together.
Yeah, you can't do it without one another.
Right.
I can't see the kingdom the way I see it now unless I've got him or half a dozen of the other guys that I hang out with and listen to, and we just randomly talk about the kingdom in some form or another, because we're all basing life on how the kingdom sees it. And I glean all the time, and iron is sharpening iron, whether we're trying to do it or we're not trying to do it. And that's the... I'm better looking and not bald like he is, but I know that the kingdom, he represents the kingdom in the glory and the magnificence of how God created him, even if he irritates me and I don't like him.
Right.
I see that. I see the creation of God there. And there was another place I was reading, I can't remember where it was, that actually touched on that. But at any rate, so I wanted to do this in verse 13 and then go back to 12.
Okay.
So verse 6.
Oh, you're really going back.
Well, I'm trying to remember exactly where we cut off here. I had it a while ago and I forgot. But he's talking about trying to get to where the gifts are. So, verse 11.
Yeah, that's a good one.
But one and the same Spirit works all things. That's what he was doing up above this. It's talking about each one of these things. It's one Spirit doing it. It's every little piece you have is the one God. So one can't be any more important than the other. Verse 12, for even as the body is one and yet has many members, and all the members, that's not where I wanted to go. For by the Spirit, 14, for the body is not one member but many. That's the foot and the eye thing. We got all that. Blah, blah, blah. That was ugly, wasn't it? Where was
Are
he
you looking at
talking about?
18?
Well, I'm looking for the, okay, here we go. Verse 27. So he's talking about how the gifts work and all that. Now he actually talks about the gifts. He says, now you're Christ's body and individually members of it. And God has appointed in the church first apostles, second prophets, third teachers, then miracles, then gifts of healing, helps, administrations, various kinds of tongues. Verse 29. All are not apostles, are they? All are not prophets, are they? All are not teachers, are they? All are not workers of miracles, are they? All do not have gifts of healing, do they? All do not speak with tongues, do they? All do not interpret, do they? But earnestly desire the greater gifts, and I show you a still more excellent way. Now keep remembering the end of 13. So I think he's really hitting them. He's bringing up those gifts specifically. And I think that they really kind of did what we do with them. They're all trying to figure out the significance thing. Like I told you last week where I got these cadets up and I said, okay, you're a lawyer and you're a doctor and you're a janitor and you're a policeman and you're a teacher. Now order yourselves in what order you think is most important. Well, the kid that was a janitor was about to start crying off to the side, and all the rest of them were about to get into a fist fight over who's supposed to get first, right? When you're looking at that from a creation standpoint, that's a ridiculous way to take it.
Yeah.
And so he switches in chapter 13. He says, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but not have love, I have become a noisy gong. So he goes through each one of these things, and he's saying, the reality of the Spirit is to draw and to feed one another. And you learn of God, the one that you have, by, wow, he's pretty cool in how he sees things and does things. Even if it's wrong in some context or another, if he loves God, those things will work themselves out.
Right.
But you can see any individual, and I'm saying this from a point of experience some level, and I consciously try to do it, especially in people that I think are evil or not one of us. And I say that in a condemning way toward me. To know that they are God's creation.
Right.
They, outside of the sinful function, were designed and created to live forever in a perfect place. Like Revelations 4 and 5 talks about what's going on in there. And if that's the case, I have no place to judge them. They may not want to be taught. They may care nothing about the kingdom, but that doesn't, I can still see the power of the creation in them, if that makes sense. I'm not trying to get hokey here, and I'm not saying they're saved. But if he is who he says he is, he encompasses everything and all of it, and him and Satan don't work in separate compartments.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, they're together in the same creation or the same space.
But Satan is encompassed even though he doesn't know it.
Right.
That's what he's trying to tell these Corinthians. They're trying to pull themselves apart to separate somehow. And if I can show I'm this spiritual guy with this and I'm that, then it's a scared reaction.
Yeah.
So in themselves, on one hand, it's not that they're trying to jockey just for permission or for position or anything. It's because they're afraid that they're not really kingdom people to some extent.
Right.
And so then you just start going nuts.
Well, and I think this is an ancient version of the same kind of stuff we were talking about a few minutes ago. Are we in? Are we out? It's the next level.
That's the exact same.
And then it goes into, okay, I know I'm in, but am I right or am I wrong? Am I doing this just right or just so? And that really is a testimony to our finite, fleshly thinking patterns.
So we had a family that we knew when we lived in Bernie. Best people you'd ever want to know. And one of their kids came with us on a mission trip. And it was just a week-long thing, and we went out in the field. And anyway, she ended up getting saved at one of these deals we were doing, right? Didn't think nothing about it, we were rejoicing over it and all that. Well, we get home, and we told her mom and dad that. Not like, well, you thought she was saved, but she really wasn't. That's not how we were presenting it at all. We're like, hey, she responded, and man, it was a cool thing. And her mama looked at me like that. No, she's been saved. I mean, she could not grasp that or wouldn't grasp it for a whole host of reasons. One of them being that she felt like that there was something wrong with her.
Right.
And she had seen this happen, and there's no way she could grasp the fact, well, if she wasn't saved in this gap that it happened over here, that couldn't be.
Yeah.
I mean, it was
Did she ever come to terms with it?
Not really.
Man, that's tough.
Yeah, and I'm not presenting that she was wrong. I'm giving it as a response to what you were saying a while ago. Are we in or are we out? Are we doing it wrong or are we not doing it wrong? And if you're insecure enough that you think you had it, whatever that is, and later on you find out you were wrong, it can destroy it. That's when you're trying to hang on to yourself.
Exactly.
That's when you're trying to, I have to do this on my own.
Well, early in my Christian walk, I was practically born in the fellowship hall. I mean, my dad's a pastor, my granddad was a pastor. But early in my teen years, especially junior high area, and partly because of just my own lifestyle and I knew myself, I really struggled with, am I going to heaven or not? And that was because that was a lot of the preaching that I was hearing was...
And if you're not doing this, you're probably not saved.
You're probably not saved if you're not doing it like this. And so I was lost all the time. I'm going to bed all the time. Lord, please don't. I don't want to go to hell. Please save me. And then there was just, I've been baptized 3 times, because honestly, and it's really silly, and we laugh, but how many times have we heard about this? And I tell people all the time. That's why I really push back on young child conversion baptisms in our culture. And now theologically, I'll sit down and have dinner with you. You want to baptize your baby? Sounds great. But I've got some things to say to you about that.
Yeah.
About what that does and does not mean, and people will disagree with me on a lot of that. But in our culture, we're like, oh, you said this prayer, we dunked you in the water, now you're good to go from now until forever. And there's even some theological things to talk to about that. But I can't tell you how many young adults I've had to untie from around the axle because their life wasn't going well. They were falling into sin. They didn't love the Lord like they were supposed to.
Yeah.
But I got that day back there, and so I know I'm okay. Or I should be okay and I'm not. And that's the real crisis of faith. And I just invite people, and here's the question. I say, are you pursuing Christ? I don't care what you did when you were 8. I really don't. What I want to know today is, are you pursuing Christ? Because the Bible talks about working out your salvation with fear and trembling. Well, I don't speak in tongues. I didn't ask you that. Are you pursuing Christ? Well, I don't have the gift of prophecy. Didn't ask you that. Are you pursuing Christ? And I think that's part of the fundamental message here is these things are great. Pursue them. They're awesome. We were commanded to pursue prophecy, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, he said if you're going to have anything,
get that
one. To pursue that one.
But he says, in the text you read, pursue the greater gift. and I'm going to show you a better way. And what does he immediately jump into? The greater gift is love.
Yeah.
And at the end of 13, he says, you can pursue all that. You can have all that. You can have your day on the calendar. But at the end of the day, the only thing that's going to be left is faith, hope, and love.
Yes.
And that's it. And so, because none of this stuff that you think marks you as being the good Christian, it's not even going to last. And here's use some of our language. That means they're not eternal. Tongues, prophecy, healings, miracles, as wonderful and as awesome as they are, they're not eternal.
Yeah.
And so
they're eternal here in this messed up kind of world, but when you actually get into eternity,
there's
no need to heal anybody.
They're not going to be there.
Yeah, it's not there.
And so in 2 Corinthians 4, when he says, focus on the unseen and not the seen, that's another, to me, version of what he's doing here. It's not that the scene is bad. It's not that the temple was bad, but they're shadows. That's not the ultimate goal. Do those things, but keep your focus on the importance.
Now, if you're feeling led to study the things of the gifts and those kind of things, we're not talking about blow these things off. Don't pay any attention. That's not what we're saying. Right. Yes, learn about those things, but in Hebrews, he tells them right up front, you should already be past this stuff, past what he called the elementary teachings.
Yep.
These gifts are the elementary teachings.
And we think,
whoa, what?
Because we've categorized them in our culture as the apex.
If you got your mind wrapped around that stuff, you're like Moses and can talk to God face to face. And you're focusing on the wrong stuff if that's what it is.
And I see it a lot. I've experienced it in my own walk a lot.
Oh yeah.
And maybe that's why I recognize it so much. And I can tell you from personal experience. I want to say this. For some of us, it takes ripping away some things that you think are important.
And you know what? That's okay.
And that's the most loving thing he can do, because it brings you into a greater knowledge of who he is and how he deals with his creation.
Yeah.
And there's a passage in 12, I think it's verse 18. Yeah, it's verse 18. When he gets through with this spiel about if every part of your body was an ear, how are you going to smell? I mean, he's really getting it simple. Yeah. This is why this is the elemental teaching. He has to break it down into kindergarten terms. You need a nose and an ear. That's all he's saying. But he says in verse 18, but as it is, he said, you think that everybody's supposed to be the same, but he's like, but in reality, but as it is, God has arranged each one of the parts of the body as he wanted to.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's where we get screwed up. We think that we get to decide what part of the body we are and what part of the body we're going to get stuck to. And he's literally telling here, if you put it in the context of the gifts, pursue them all you want, but you'll get what he gives you.
Yeah.
And you will perform the functions as part of Christ's body as he decides.
Yeah.
And we get mad about that.
Yeah, I was about to say that. You have to learn to be okay with that.
Well, because we joke back and forth, that I think there's 3 people watching our show today. Okay? There's guys with terrible content that have hundreds of thousands. I mean, there are people that do their makeup on YouTube and have 1 million viewers.
I've seen some of that.
And I'm like, and they're making millions of dollars doing the weirdest dumb things, and I just don't get it. Yeah, we have 3 people watching the show.
It is interesting.
And so we joke about that. But that's even that sort of silly thing, because you're like, okay, why do y'all do this podcast? We do this podcast because we love the body of Christ, and we feel like there's things that God has shown us that we want to share.
Yeah.
End of story. Whether it's 1, 3, 1 million, it really doesn't matter. but several weeks ago, I guess it was the Sunday after Eli was killed, and we were telling that story. Maybe it was the week after the funeral. We had a couple come up to us at church, and he was in tears, and that day was like 4 weeks in, then they had lost their adult son. And it's one couple, one family, but there was a connection made there that we couldn't have made any other way.
Yeah.
And there was ministry that got to be done there, and we kind of helped each other in that moment. We prayed for one another, and we were able to comfort one another. And it's easy, like the Corinthians did, to get into this. I want what everybody can see.
Yeah.
And that's really what some of the problems with the gifts are. I want the things that everybody can see, and those aren't even the things that are eternal.
Well, and they're also markers of a point. Say, well, you don't really have the Spirit unless you speak in tongues or if you can heal. And it's almost like people say that because they're looking to see what's in you with that. And I would tell you that that's trying to see eternal things through your fleshly mind. Right. I don't mean fleshly in an evil sense. I mean in less than the kingdom sense. But Paul keeps telling them, and Paul is an example to himself. Obviously, they think he's somebody, and he's done all of these gifts that you say. He's done it through the walk and doing whatever. And he's not even saying, well, I have this. I mean, he says he's an apostle, but then as you keep reading through there, and he's going, but you know what? Compared to the other apostles, I'm a nobody from nowhere.
Right.
And he meant it. Anyway, I forgot where I was going with that. It was good, too.
Well, if it comes back to you, holler. I guess for me, the thing that I want to really drive home today is that's, I guess, that the Lord has been revealing to me and helping me experience is I've got to get out of my own head about what I think is important, what I think I need to please God and to be in His graces, because that's really kind of what it boils down to.
Yeah.
I want to please the Lord, and so I want to do this thing. And in our attempts to make what God is doing achievable, we've built these systems of thought and these systems of theology, frankly, that take stuff out of the eternal and bring it down into we build our own little baby towers of Babel that we can climb. And I read into this and I hear Paul going, stop doing that.
Yeah.
Please stop doing that. And, even over in chapter 13 where it says, when that which is perfect is come, these will pass away. There is a whole theological hotbed, we call it cessationists, that they will say, oh, well, that's the canon. That when the canon of Scripture comes, all of these are going to pass away. But if you really are, and that's really a strange argument. I kind of grew up as a cessationist. I grew up with that argument. It's a very weak one linguistically. If you look into the language, the context that he's talking about is we won't need these gifts when Jesus comes. When He comes, we're going to have all this. And so, but the fact that we have this doctrine that's people I respect and are smarter than me still hold to, that say, well, once the canon was complete, we don't have these gifts anymore. I respect them, but that is an attempt to humanly explain things that we cannot explain.
Well, it makes a space for those that may not naturally be gifted with those things as reasoning functions that, oh, well, I don't need to deal with any of that.
It gives them relevance.
It does. Yeah.
I don't need.
So does the other side. So, I mean, you got one or the two doing the same thing. You're trying to prove it in your own power.
Because, I mean, there was times in my walk where I thought I wasn't, nobody ever told me this. I felt like, from what I saw, I wasn't as good of a Christian because I didn't have a gift.
Yeah.
I remember early in my teenage years, honest to goodness, this happened, and I cannot believe I'm about to say it. I thought, well, I need to go out and ruin my life for a little while and then repent and come back so I've got a story to tell. Because, I would see these guys, that's what we do, though. We bring in these guys, they were on death row, and they were this, and they were that, and it's great stories of God's redemption. But I thought, well, if I don't have one of those stories, to use his body analogy, I'm just a little toe.
Yeah.
I'm not anything exciting. And he goes through some in-depth conversation about what we do with our uncomely parts and what we do with our honorable parts.
Yeah.
And how we treat them with honor. But there was this weird undertow in evangelical Christianity that if you didn't have this big story of going to the dregs and coming back, that you weren't as significant and that God couldn't use you as much. And I think part of what Paul's saying here is that's baloney.
Yeah.
That's junk. And he's like, what's important is that you will do whatever it is faithfully that God has decided for you to do in the body.
How God decides is the journey.
Yeah.
That's part of it. John says, you want to know about kingdom, how to do all that stuff? Know God.
Yeah.
That's the kingdom. So, okay, that's what I'm doing all this for. I'm trying to know God. Yeah, you do the academic side of that. You pursue it. You'll find out you're wrong in some context. That's when you find out your heart is really pursuing the Lord and not trying to pursue to make sure you're in, or if I'm covered, or, all those other things. And what does it mean when you see somebody that knows God? Well, in the Old Testament, we just talked about Moses and saying that when all the people were grumbling and coming after him, he would turn around and he'd go, why are you yelling at me? This is him. Well, in the New Testament side, John the Baptist is one of those. His disciples were doing that. They were, and I'm not kicking them. They were trying to work out. They were seeing eternal things through him, and they were doing all that stuff. And then Jesus starts taking on with his ministry, and they get a little irritated with their master, and they're like, because they'd sacrificed to follow him in that culture. And the first thing John does is he turns around and he says, you can have nothing unless it's given to you from the kingdom.
Right.
That's somebody who's looking at the kingdom, and it seemed like maybe a weird answer when he got it. So I don't know. That's how do I know I'm talking to God? Well, when I've watch instances like that, or I'll be visiting with a brother or listening to a sermon or something, and somebody says something, it's like, whoa, and it resonates all the way through.
Yeah.
That helps me take another step. And I would tell you, sometimes those are nuggets. God throws those out there because you don't have a complete picture, and now you're almost kind of frustrated trying to figure it out. And you do it on your own, and then so he knows you're doing that. That's part of it.
And I think
that's how you learn it.
I think it's designed that way,
It
too.
is designed
It's not
that
just
way.
like, oh, these poor schlepply humans, this is how they're going to have to do it. He's designed it that way.
Yeah.
That's part of the whole point. We'll talk about it another day. We got to land this plane.
Yeah.
That's part of the whole role of suffering and trial and affliction.
Yes.
Is it grinds you down into a place of all you can do is look at him, and that's when you really start learning, and that's when you start fellowshipping with him on a very different level. There's a reason the scriptures say that God is near the brokenhearted, because it's when you're brokenhearted and you got nothing else, you learn the most about him, and then you can start putting into context, real context and real application, maybe the academic nuggets that you've been studying about.
So I can't remember where it's at, but there was the guy in the church that was obviously doesn't necessarily say he's doing wicked and evil things, but he's obviously acting like a non-Christian. And Paul says, you need to cut that guy out and let Satan sift him for a while.
Yeah.
We just assume that he was an unsaved guy and he needs to go get saved. I don't know, I kind of read that different. I think he was probably in the body, but he still wanted his own stuff, because you can read all over the place where God's like turned away or been quiet or some of that kind of stuff, and people start flailing and doing all kinds of things. That is a tool that he uses to get you to a point where he's going to reach down and jerk out by the roots.
Yeah.
If that's the case and that's where you find yourself, I would tell you your heart's perfect toward the Lord.
And you can
Or
rejoice
that would
in
have
that.
never got to that point.
Right, because he only chastens those he loves.
Yes.
And those that are his. And so, lots of different tangential conversations we can have on that, but we gotta land the plane today. Are you going to be in Canton Sunday?
No.
You're not going to be there?
No.
I'm going to be preaching at China Grove Baptist Church this weekend. Look forward to that. Tim's not.
No, I'm next week. All next week I'll be preaching at
Canton
Canton Bible Church.
And so if you are out there and you need somebody to fill in for you, we are available for that, and love to do pulpit supply. Don't forget to go out into your Google Play or the App Store and download our app. It's got all of our teachings on there, and we do special announcements and things on there from time to time that just come through the app. So want to encourage you to do that. Share the podcast. Appreciate you coming to join us today, or if you're watching this after the fact, make a comment if you don't mind us knowing that you're watching, which some people apparently do. I wouldn't be associated with us either sometimes, but yeah, make a comment. Let us know you're watching. Appreciate it. See y'all next time.